Welcome everybody to our first session of CNC High School Literacy Club. Hi, my name is Sean Jian, and I am the CNC Student Union President and one of the hosts for this afternoon. Now, before we begin, I want to actually preface this event by letting everyone know that this event is made possible by CNC Education Foundation, which is different from CNC Education Center. The CNC Education Foundation Center, our focus is as a nonprofit organization is to focus on improving student leadership skills, mentorship skills, and fellowship skills. Ultimately, we want to provide students the opportunity to practice and develop these skills. And so today, we'll have Mr. Acheson as a speaker to discuss the themes and ideas presented within the book Lord of the Flies. And accompanying me is Victor Liu.
Hello everyone. My name is Victor and I'm the president of CNC Literacy Club, and I'll be one of your hosts for today. Mr. Acheson, like Sean said, will be our panel speaker today, and he will discuss the themes and ideas in the novel The Lord of the Flies. I'm just going to give you a bit more information on Mr. Acheson. So Mr. Acheson is the most popular 5-star teacher among all the students in CNC Edu Center. Currently, Evan is teaching with the Calgary Board of Education. He holds a Bachelor of Education from the University of Calgary, and an honors degree in English Literature from St. Mary's University, with a minor in political science. With over 14 years of experience tutoring and teaching students one-on-one and in small groups, Evan offers a highly relational approach to teaching English language arts that emphasizes the importance of authentic connection. While cultivating basic skills in studying literacy texts and strengthening creative and essay writing, he challenges his students to think critically, communicate effectively, and engage with ideas passionately. Through his experiences working with hundreds of high school and junior high students, he has become versatile in his strategies for assessment, and dynamic in his ability to respond to diverse areas of student need and interest. As an experienced writer, lover of literature, music composer, piano player, and singer, Evan's lifelong curiosity and love of learning continue to fuel his passion for teaching. Thank you.
Yeah, so Evan, take it away.
Wow. Okay, that was quite the introduction. Holy smokes. I didn't know I was the most popular 5-star teacher. Wow, that is an incredible honor. Also, a slight correction, I don't actually work for the Calgary Board of Education. I work for a charter school actually called STEM Innovation Academy. So it's a brand new school. Right now it's a junior high, but next year we are hoping to open a high school as well. And the focus of the school is integrating science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, along with the humanities, social studies, and English, to create a lot of really cool, engaging, problem-based learning strategies, right? Where you get to work together with other people to use your knowledge in different sciences and math and English, put them together to solve complicated real-world problems. So I've been really enjoying being an English and social studies teacher there. I've been working with grade 7 and 8 students this last year. And so the opportunity that Lucia offered for me to come and share with you today at a high school level, I know not all of you are in high school, but this is very exciting for me to be able to talk about great works of literature and to be able to have conversations with people who care. So thanks for being here. So just a show of hands or in the chat, how many of you have now finished reading this book? Has anyone finished reading this book yet? How much do you know about this book? Let's see what you're going to say in the chat. Okay, a few people have finished. Okay. I'm seeing there's already a question from Mulan. Mulan, what's your question?
Is it okay if you haven't finished?
Yes, it is totally okay if you haven't finished. So I will do my best to explain some of the ideas around what I'm talking about, so that if you have finished or you haven't finished, you'll still have an understanding of what are the big ideas here in this book, okay? So I have a little PowerPoint presentation I threw together. It's nothing impressive, but it will help us lead some of the conversation. And I also have a digital version of the book open as well. So I'll be able to share my screen and share that with you guys. Now, it looks like screen sharing has been approved for me. So thank you for doing that, whoever was in charge of that. So here we are. So I just have a copy of the text here. I'll be kind of bouncing around from one part to another likely. But but I definitely want to start right here. So let's begin with a little slideshow. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Give me a thumbs up, Sean, if you can see it. Okay, great. So Lord of the Flies by William Golding. So why the heck is this such an important book, right? You guys ever wonder why is it that some books end up becoming so classic and so famous and so widely taught? And the answer is because there's something in that book that connects it to what it means to be a human being, right? It's not just a story, but it's an important story that teaches us something about who we are as people, not just as individuals, but who we are as a group of people, as a society. And one of the major ideas in this book is exactly that. Who are we as people? Are we more influenced by our desire to come together and form civilization and community? Or are we more influenced by our deep impulses towards destructiveness or violence? So basically, that's the simple question. Who here ever has made a beautiful sandcastle before, or a Lego castle, or something out of Lego, something out of building blocks, and you thought, wow, it's so beautiful and I feel amazing. And someone, maybe a sibling, a brother or sister, has come over and knocked it down or destroyed it. And they have this evil grin in their face and they're so excited they destroyed whatever it was you built. Or maybe you felt that impulse before, right? And you thought maybe it's fun to destroy something, more fun than creating something. And what that desire tells us is that inside of us, we have both of those desires, don't we? We have the love of creating, but also a strange and not very healthy thrill from destroying things. And it's so easy to destroy something, and it's so hard to create something. So it creates a bit of an interesting problem for us as humans. And that's another big idea in this book, right? Do we as humans want to create things, or do we want to destroy things? Okay, I see the chat is still buzzing. Your sister doesn't care about Lego, so she doesn't touch them. That's good. That's very nice. I remember I built a Lego castle once when I was about 10 years old. And my little brother, who was still running around in diapers at the time, he didn't really know what he was doing. He just came and sat down on top of it, and it crushed it completely. And I was devastated. I'd worked hours on building that. So
May or may not have been on purpose, though. So
at least it wasn't on purpose, right? Exactly. He didn't know what he was doing. Okay, so let's talk about historical context. Okay, so does anyone know what the word context means? Could you explain that for me? You can maybe put your hand up. I can't see everybody either, so I'm just going to shuffle through and try to get a look at everybody's screen here. Who can explain what this word context means? Maybe put a digital hand up or your real hand.
Also, the chat is another way which you can respond to questions. So maybe if your mic isn't working, definitely you can just type your answer in the chat.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, if you would like to type in the chat the answer, what does the word context mean?
What does the word context mean? And also, even if your answer isn't totally correct, that's also fine too. Just
I encourage wrong answers. I love wrong answers. Wrong answers are just an opportunity to get the right answer later.
Okay, I think Lila put up his hand.
Lila, what do you think?
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I think context is like a way of giving background information on something so that like it makes sense.
Totally. It's background information. It's also the situation that surrounds something to help it make more sense. Okay. We have another raised hand. I don't see your name though. Go ahead. What's your name, girl with your hand up?
Iris.
Hi, Iris. I see your name now. Iris, go ahead.
So I think context means the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea.
Absolutely. Yes. That was very good. Almost dictionary-like. So that is exactly what we're talking about. And we're talking about historical context specifically. Do we have another hand up here? Go ahead.
I think context means like something you need for something else to make sense.
That's another really good way of putting it. kind of the information you need for something else to make sense. So let's talk about the context of this story historically. So historically, we need to know what's going on at the time when this book was first written, okay? So it was written in 1954. That's when it was first written and published. So what was the world like in 1954? What have you learned in other classes or social studies or history? Can someone tell me what was going on in the world in 1954? Yes, with the shark background. Your hand is up. Go ahead.
The Cold War was happening.
So the Cold War had just begun, hadn't it? Right? So the Cold War kind of unofficially started right after World War II, as soon as the United States used the atomic bomb on Japan twice. And suddenly they demonstrated their incredible power in a military way, in a very scary way. And then immediately after the Second World War, the Soviet Union, now Russia, also rose in a lot of its power after the defeat of Germany in the Second World War. And you started to have these two superpowers, right? The United States and the Soviet Union. And that created the next like 40 years of conflict between them. So you're right, that's the beginning of the Cold War. So my next question is this. What did people fear, worry about, or hope for around this time period? What were people thinking about? So someone said nukes, also the space race. James Fang, thanks so much. Nukes in the space race, I totally agree, right? So nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear weapons, right? Suddenly there's these extremely powerful weapons that can destroy whole cities. People were scared. Of course they were scared. So there became sort of a different amount of fear in the world about what the future would hold, whether technology would be a good thing or a bad thing, right? We talk a lot about technology even now, right? Like you might all have a phone and you might all know that being on your phone can be good. It can connect you to other people and to the internet, but being on your phone too much can be really bad. You can actually get addicted to your phone, right? And so technology, even back then, there's always a good side of technology and a bad side, right? It depends what you do with it. So people were scared of another war, of course, and they were especially scared of nuclear war. So if you've read this book, there's actually little bits of reference to the idea that maybe there's a nuclear war happening. Okay, so it's supposed to imagine, I think, the slight future after when it was written, and a world in which there had been a much more devastating war with nuclear weapons used. And so the background for the book, if you haven't read it, is these boys, this group of boys, they're fleeing England because of war, because of the threat of danger and war. And they end up getting shot down. Their plane gets shot down and they land on this island and the pilot dies in the plane crash. And the boys, who are all about, 12 years old, the older ones, and then even 6 years old, the younger ones, they're stranded on this island, right? And what are they going to do? That's the big question. Okay. So that's the historical context, is that this book was very much inspired by the fear and the worry about war that was happening. And it was imagining a world where that destructive side of humans had fully overpowered the more productive side, right? Inside of us, I talked about that idea that we get inspired to create and to share and to give and to come together in communities. And that's the good side. But the bad side is sometimes we try to destroy. Okay, so that's some of the historical context. That's number two. Number three is, how had the world been changed because of the events of the first half of the 20th century? Okay, so there was another major war before the Second World War, right? So the First World War and the Second World War. And then James, if you want to add, how else do you think the world had been changed? Go ahead, James.
Well, because there was 2 world wars, I think people were kind of afraid that there was going to be a third.
Exactly. So before the First World War, right? So the First World War started in 1914 and went until 1918. So before 1914, people's outlook for the future was very hopeful, right? They had actually experienced, since the middle of the 1800s to the beginning of the 1900s, humans had experienced the greatest amount of technology progress in human history. We had built entire city skylines, right? Skyscrapers went up all over the world. We developed all kinds of electricity. Suddenly you could have light bulbs that just burn and show light without any fire. That was totally mind-blowing to people. You develop appliances. People don't have to, dig a hole in their backyard and put ice in it to keep it cold and put their food in there, right? They have a refrigerator inside their house now. All these things were amazingly new, not to mention cars. Cars came onto the scene around then too. And so the general viewpoint at this point, especially in the United States and in Europe, was that, wow, the future is going to be amazing. Technology is solving all of humans' problems. What could possibly go wrong? And this is what they were thinking. And then suddenly in 1914, the war broke out, and it really took away people's hope for a brighter future. They started realizing, well, technology can be used for good, but it can also be used to create weapons of war. And that's why the First World War was so deadly too, is because people didn't realize how powerful the new weapons had become. So what you see is kind of across the world, people's general feeling of hope towards the future and technology was destroyed. And so suddenly people are way more realistic, and they even get pessimistic. The word pessimistic means you don't really think anything good can happen in the future now. So this is sort of the world that this book was inspired by, right? So the Second World War had just ended, millions of people had died, and this war had only come like about 20 years after the first war that killed millions of people. So you can imagine that people in the 1950s, they were afraid of another war, like you suggested, James. And there was a distrust about humanity. There was no longer this feeling that humans are completely good. There was this idea that humans have the capability for both good and evil, the capability for incredible productivity and creation, but also the capability to destroy and to kill. So that is why I'm telling you all this stuff, because you have to understand this worldview before you can really appreciate this book, The Lord of the Flies. Okay. So the next thing, I just kind of answered question 4. That's how people's beliefs about human nature changed, right? They suddenly were more distrustful that people were good and going to do the right thing. So the next one is a literary allusion. So I don't know if you've heard of this word allusion before. It's not like illusion with an I at the beginning. It's a different kind of word. A literary allusion is where a book will try to reference another book or a work of literature, okay? So in this book, The Lord of the Flies, it was actually inspired by another book. It was inspired by a book called The Coral Island by R.M. Ballantyne. Has anyone here heard of that book, The Coral Island? Just write in the chat whether you've heard of it or not. Okay, so Alex has. It's not super popular today, but it was quite popular when William Golding wrote The Lord of the Flies, and it was a very popular book. Oh, TED Ed, you've seen it on TED Ed, very good. So I'm pretty sure this class goes until 4 o'clock. Is that correct, or does it go longer than that? Till 4? Okay, great. So this is super interesting. So he wrote this book, not just from his own head, but almost as a response to this book, The Coral Island. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about The Coral Island, okay? The Coral Island is about 3 boys named Ralph, Jack, and Peterkin. Does this sound familiar except for Peterkin? There's a Ralph and there's a Jack in Lord of the Flies, who are stranded on an island and manage to excel in the environment because they are English and have access to the wealth of knowledge that civilization brings. They end up confronting the savage tribes that live there and converting them to Christianity. So that's kind of what happens in this book. It's meant to show that Western civilization, especially the British Empire, is superior to all other nations. That was one of the messages that this book was presenting to its readers, right? There's all these savages who don't know anything about, civilization. They don't know anything good about being human. And these young British boys sort of teach them all a lesson and then change their faith as well. And so this book, it was very popular at the time, but I wonder what William Golding would have thought about this book. I wonder if he would have thought it was realistic. Okay, so that brings me to my next slide here. So here's a cover of this book, right? Look how nice these young white boys look as they're meeting the tribal inhabitants of the island. They look awfully like rosy-cheeked and healthy for kids who probably haven't been eating very well, stranded on an island. So my question for you is this: why do you think Golding purposely set out to challenge Ballantyne's ideas? What do you think he was challenging, and why do you think he was trying to challenge the ideas of this book, The Coral Island? Don't tribes have weapons? James says. Yes, they do. I don't know exactly how that relates.
Alex John also had his hand up, but he put it down. Alex, would you like
still there, Alex?
Respond to the question? If not, that's your mic isn't working.
His mic isn't working. You can feel free to type your answer if you'd like to, Alex.
If not, that's also fine too. So don't worry about it.
Absolutely. Okay, well, maybe he's typing at the moment, but would anyone else like to share? Oh, so James just asked me a direct message. If you want to turn your direct message off, James, just so the whole group can see your comments, that would probably be better. But James said, wouldn't the tribes take the boys captive or kill them since they're savages? Yes, I think that in the course of the book, there are confrontations that could get violent. But mostly the message at the end is these young British boys, they end up stopping the conflict between one savage tribe and another one, right? So they're there to bring peace, the peace of civilization that solves all the world's problems. And this, of course, speaking from the British Empire, which at the time owned 1/4 of the world's land surface and had killed many untold civilizations and cultures and taken slaves in order to do that. So there's some problems here. Would anyone else like to talk about that? Why, and what's another reason maybe why William Golding wanted to challenge some of the ideas presented in this first book, The Coral Island?
Let's see. So no one has their hand.
I see
Deanne and Joanne. So if you guys could unmute your mic,
that'd
be awesome.
So maybe
Briefly unmute it.
it was like unfair,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe like other religions like Jewish or something is also not stupid, I guess.
Yeah, so there is sort of a religious component, right? This idea, right? There's many faiths in the world, many religions. And a lot of those religions have histories of trying to force other people to believe what they believe, right? And so whatever religion you might have, it can be a beautiful thing, right, for you, and it can enrich your life and create a sense of importance and meaning in your life and give you strong values. But there's definitely problems historically too, right? When people who try too hard, they even use threats of violence if people don't turn to their religion. And so it's basically, it's almost arrogant, I think. That was the tone of this book. So arrogant means you think you're better than everybody else. So the message of this book was very strongly, the British Empire is better than everybody else, and everyone has something to learn from the British Empire. And do you guys think it's realistic that some boys would maybe crash land or get stranded on an island and they wouldn't fight with each other? They would get along really well, and they would always just know what to do, and they could solve problems without conflict. Do you think that's realistic? No. Serena says no. Who else agrees with Serena that that's not actually very realistic? That probably wouldn't happen in real life. Yeah.
I do agree.
Yeah. And so that's one of the things that Golding was trying to do. I think he would have laughed at this book And he would have said, this is not realistic. There's no way that this would happen. A bunch of 12-year-old boys would figure out how to get along in the wilderness when they're going hungry and they're not sure if they're ever going to see their homes again. I don't think so. And so what we see in The Lord of the Flies is a far more realistic depiction of what would happen. Okay. It would not be easy. There would be fighting, there would be conflict, there would be struggles for power, and there would be violence. Alex says, because all people have this beast in them when they're desperate, they will do anything to survive. Oh, it sounds like you've read the book, Alex. The author had an ethnocentric view against other cultures. So that's another great word. So ethnocentrism is the idea that your culture is better than other cultures, okay? That your culture has it right, that they're superior, okay? William Golding challenged this idea because he thought that Europeans weren't people that are better than everyone else. He challenged this idea because of how unrealistic the book was. Also, keep in mind, the war has just happened. Do you think an author would really think that humans are only good after watching the world destroy itself? I don't think so, right? So, nah, bro, do it like this. 12-year-olds proceed to go crazy and have a massive kill streak. Yes, that's a good description of what happens. And James, you added, I mean that some boys get stranded on an island and surviving without fighting in real life, but they were teenagers. Yes. So it could happen. But what we see in this book is incredible conflicts of personality. Now, let's keep going. That's a great conversation. So I want to teach you guys about characterization. So characterization is the way that an author will show you what a character is like. And there's two basic forms of characterization. There's direct characterization and there's indirect. So direct characterization is where the author or the narrator just straight up describes what a character is like. They just tell you what they're like, okay? So they describe the character's physical appearance, their personality, things that motivate them. And it's useful for giving broad details in a sentence or two. So here's an example. Alicia was tall and well-dressed. She was happy to start her first day of work, and she was feeling confident, right? There's no mysteries there for the reader. We understand exactly who the character is because the author has told us who they are. Now, indirect characterization is more complicated, and I think it's more fun, actually, too. This is where your skill as a reader really comes into play. Indirect is where they show you what the character is like. They don't tell you, they show you. They hint to the reader what a character is like by describing the character's appearance, their speech, their thoughts and feelings, and their interactions with other characters, right? So we will see the actions of a character, we will hear their words, and then we as readers say, what does this tell us about how they're feeling? What does this tell us about what motivates them? What does this tell us about what they value in their lives, right? So it's really useful for developing really complex characters through background and subtext. Subtext means you have to really read close to figure out maybe what the author is suggesting rather than what they're saying. Okay, so an example to counteract the first one is Alicia slammed her fist on the table. I want all of you out of my office now. She tore the earnings report in half and threw it into the trash. So we don't have any details in this second example that just explain or tell us what Alicia is like. We read her actions and we read her words, and then it's up for us as readers to decide, oh, she seems like she's a mean boss. She seems like she demands respect from her workers. She seems like maybe she can lose her temper and get a little bit angry, right? And we know that not because the author told us, but because they showed us. So this is actually a super helpful tip when you are writing stories too, right? If you are a creative writer and you like to write, try to do both, the telling and the showing, but it's the showing that actually makes for better storytelling, right? Don't so much tell me what your character is like, show me what they're like by their words and by their actions. Okay, so that's just a little sidebar about creative writing. Now, as readers, this is important for us because the author's trying to give us a message. The author's trying to show us who these characters are, what they're like, okay? So there's a little lesson on characterization. Now back to the book. So each of these main characters, Ralph, Jack, Piggy, and Simon, are all different from each other. So for those of you who've read it, you might know kind of the differences between these characters, but what are they like and how do we know? So let's start with Ralph. Who can tell me, someone who's read the book, what is Ralph like kind of at the beginning of this story? Is that with the shark, is that James? So your name disappears when the hand goes up.
Yeah, it's James. So yeah, James. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself.
James, go ahead.
Ralph is basically a leader.
He is a leader. You're absolutely right. Anyone else want to add? What are some characteristics about Ralph? Is he always like a super nice guy? Okay, so Ralph, he is the main leader. He ends up being the leader of the whole group of boys. How about Jack? What is Jack like? Okay, James says Jack is a rebel. Absolutely. Jack is a rebel, and Jack and Ralph end up having a lot of conflicts. Jack is a toxic kid, Minghao says. He's greedy, Joanna says. Absolutely. He wants power. So James is also typing Piggy is a follower. Let's move on to Piggy. So Piggy's a follower. What other aspects of Piggy's character can we see? What's his personality like? Anyone else want to say? Piggy's good at thinking. Exactly. So Piggy is super intelligent, and he's always good at solving problems. Sean, what do you think? Any ideas about Piggy?
He's more timid in a sense compared to the other boys. Maybe not
Absolutely.
as assertive.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, Piggy has some good messages in the book. So one thing about Piggy is he offers sort of, I think, like the conscience of the book. He represents the conscience of the boys. He usually says what he thinks is right, and he usually has really good ideas. And the other boys do not always listen to his ideas. Piggy is super smart, exactly. And so Piggy represents sort of this frustrating reality that he's got the right answers, but because no one respects him enough, they're not going to listen to him. And that's really frustrating for us as readers, because we're like, just listen to Piggy. Yeah, spoiler alert, Piggy dies. Yes, that's right. How about Simon? Let's talk about Simon. What is his character like? So quick question, Sean, are you guys going to keep talking about this book for a few weeks? Or is it just today?
I don't believe so. It's just today.
Okay. You're moving on? Okay. Okay, good. So Simon is a really interesting character. He represents the goodness of humanity. He's kind and he's respectful. And ultimately, the boys, when they turn savage, Simon can't possibly survive in that world. Okay, so we're going to keep moving here. Because I think I'm getting the sense that only a few of you have read this, I'm going to just press pause on some of these questions because you might not have the answers. Okay. We will talk I want to give you a sense of major topics. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the human impulses, right? Civilization versus savagery. So an impulse, can anyone describe what the word impulse means? Just maybe in the chat. What is an impulse? An action done before it's thought through. I really like that, Serena. That's a great definition. So we all have actions that sometimes we do without thinking. That's what an impulse is. And as humans, in this book, it's sort of talking about these two major impulses, right? We have the impulse to create civilization, to form communities and friendships, and to build social environments, right? We do it almost without thinking because it's a part of who we are. We're attracted to other people. But we have this other impulse towards savagery, which means almost to become like animals, right? We forget about moral good and evil. We do what is right. We do what feels good, and we stop caring about other people. We become selfish. And usually that means we end up alone in one way or another when we kind of indulge that savage impulse inside of us. And that's one of the messages of this book. Okay, some other major topics. There's two kinds of power. Okay, so Ralph, he represents a kind of power called authority, and Jack represents a kind of power that we call violence. So we're going to get into this, I think, a little bit into the text, but around chapter 3 or 4, the tension between Jack and Ralph becomes really bad. They're able to get along for the first little bit, but Ralph ends up getting voted by the group as the leader. So through the democratic process. And as we know, democracy is a part of civilization. And so Ralph gets this sort of respect, and he has this sense of authority. Authority is the kind of power where you just respect him. So here's what happens. If you haven't read it, he finds this shell. It's a conch shell. I don't know if you've ever seen one. He finds it lying on the beach and he blows into it like a trumpet. And this sound reverberates around the island. And then all the boys, after the plane crash, they hear it and they come towards him. And so symbolically, it's like he is calling them together to form a civilization. They're off on their own in the wilderness, and he calls them, and they come out onto the beach. And suddenly this conch shell becomes a symbol of Ralph's authority over the group. And they respect him, and they respect the power of this shell. And so right from that beginning, we start to see that Ralph has a certain kind of power. He can influence the other boys because they respect him and they respect his leadership. But that's not the only kind of power in this book. The other kind of power is violence. It's the kind of power you have when you make threats, right? And so you could have authority, right? But there could be someone to challenge that authority using violence, and it's a different kind of power. And so who do we see in this story trying to use violence and threat as a form of power? Yeah, Joanna says it's Jack. It's Jack. And so around chapter 4, we start to see this standoff between Ralph and Jack, right? And Ralph has the conch shell, but what does Jack have? Jack has some other object that's important. What does Jack have that sort of represents his violence? It's an object that he carries. It's not a spear. It's close. He ends up having a spear as well. But before that, it's a knife. Okay, we see him with a knife in the first chapter as well. And so this is Golding's way of showing two kinds of power, right? And one kind of power, like authority, it makes you feel good to respect it. You feel like you're a part of society, right? It's like you are brought into society because of the power and the respect and the authority of a good leader, right? So that's one way that you might want to follow a good leader, is because you're inspired to follow them. What's another reason why you might be motivated to follow a more violent leader? What do you think? It's not inspiration. Serena's right. It's fear. So some people rule with inspiration and authority, and some people rule with fear of violence. And this is one of the biggest differences between Jack and Ralph in the story, right? Is the way that they hold their power. Jack's inspires, creates inspiration, and Ralph's creates inspiration and Jack's creates fear. So that's another major idea in this book, major topics. Good versus evil. I've talked about this a little bit, right? Like the Second World War and even the First World War, both of them together, they really made it painfully clear to the world that there is the possibility for good and evil in every one of us. And that's what this book is showing as well. Spear plus fear equals 3D circle. I love your chats, you guys. Really good. Okay, another topic is the loss of innocence. Can anyone explain to me what this might mean? What does the loss of innocence mean? What is innocence? Gabriella, straight face. Serena, go ahead.
I feel like since you're like a child, people older than you, especially parents, try to like protect you from like the not so good parts about life and like the bad parts of the world. So I feel like kind of the moment where you start to realize that there are bad things that go on too. That's kind of where that loss of innocence is.
Yeah, that's excellent. Do we want to add to that? Sorry, what's your name with your hand up right now?
Iris.
Hi, Iris. Go ahead, Iris.
Innocence is kind of like it's kind of like a lack of guilt.
So it can also be a lack of guilt. That's right, because you haven't done anything bad. You're still kind of like, you're good and you're pure. And then also, it's exactly what you have both said, right? And so this idea that when you're a child, you have innocence, right? You don't even really understand what bad things are. You kind of learn that the world can be an evil place or a bad place. And it will slowly happen to all of us, I think, at different times, depending on what happens to us when we're young. But slowly, it's this slow waking up to the fact that there is bad stuff in the world. And you're right. Sometimes your parents, they do a good job of shielding you from that. But eventually, as you grow up, it becomes learning to see the difference between good and bad. And it can feel painful because suddenly you don't see the world as a perfect place anymore. That's another major idea in this book, because they start out as children in this story. And because of the violence and because of the fear that they experience from the beginning to the end of the book, at the very end, Ralph is weeping. In the final scene, it's beautiful. And it says, Ralph wept for the loss of innocence. And so he's mourning all the bad, terrible things that have happened to him. And he's lost a little bit of his optimism, a little bit of his hope. And in that sense, there's sort of a bittersweet ending that's both a little bit happy and sad at the same time. So that's another huge idea in this story. Okay, so I just want to turn to the actual book itself. And I just want to look at some of the beautiful writing that Mr. Golding creates here. So 1 second, sharing screen again. Okay, so right at the beginning, we see all these boys that just land on the beach, right? Or in the forest. And so the boy with fair hair lowered himself down the last few feet of rock and began to pick his way toward the lagoon. That's the first sentence. And this is a description of Ralph. And we don't even get his name right away. The author just describes him as the boy with fair hair, right? So we don't know him yet. He's just a boy. And for some reason, he's in the middle of the jungle. And we find out as he goes through. Okay, so he's still wearing his school sweater, but he's in the middle of the jungle. Okay, he's taken off his school sweater and trailed it now from one hand. His gray shirt stuck to him and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All around him, the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and broken trunks when a bird, a vision of yellow and red, flashed upward with a witch cry, and this cry was echoed by another. Okay, so what I find so beautiful and striking about this opening passage is the strong sense of contrast between Ralph and his environment. What do you think I'm talking about? What do you notice here where there's a sense of contrast between Ralph and his surroundings? Anyone? Wow, Minghao, you still have the same background you did from last time I taught you. Minghao, what do you notice? I'm putting you on the spot.
That is a very big jungle because it's echoing.
Okay. What about the sense of contrast specifically between Ralph and his environment?
He's probably like a bit of a stranger to it since he doesn't really know what he's doing.
Good. Does it look like he belongs in this environment?
No, because he's wearing his school uniform. You don't wear uniforms in jungles.
Yeah, and specifically a school sweater. My goodness, doesn't look like he's dressed for the tropical heat, does he? So already we can understand that Ralph is out of place. And that's one of the strongest messages that Golding is trying to create from the very beginning, is to show he doesn't belong here. He's out of place. Okay, so there is this sense that there's another boy suddenly, okay? And this boy is Piggy. And so immediately we're sensing a friendship or relationship between them. But let's pay attention to whether we think they get along or not. This other boy is described as the fat boy, and he is Piggy. So there was a pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger cabin. He was up front. So they've lost their pilot. Aren't there any grown-ups at all? I don't think so. In case of the boys realize they're all alone. The boy said this solemnly, but then the delight of a realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. Okay, so this first boy is standing on his head. That, to me, just shows how playful and childlike he is at the start of this book. Now, we know that with this idea of the loss of innocence, all these characters are going to grow up a lot. They're going to start out as children, but through the pain and the challenges they experience, they're going to end up with a lot more maturity by the end. And so I can see how playful he is at the beginning, right? He's just standing on his head just for the fun of it. This is not the sort of thing Ralph will be doing by the end of the book. He will lose his sense of playfulness. No grown-ups, the fat boy thought for a moment. That pilot. The fair boy allowed his feet to come down and sat on the steamy earth. We was attacked. Right? So that we understand now that the plane has been shot down. But how do you think Ralph feels about the fact that there's no grown-ups on the island? What do we see? How does he feel? No grown-ups. Is this excitement or is it fear? Gabriella, go ahead.
Happy.
He's totally happy, right? He's like, oh my goodness, no rules. I get to be my own boss. I get to have fun and play all I want, right? This is definitely something, again, that he's going to change his mind about. It's easy to say when you're still full, and then suddenly you got to go find food on an island. Uh-oh, you can't play all the time. Okay, so they talk about how they're going to get away and what happened to the pilot. And so just going to scroll down here to where it happens, this moment where he finds the conch shell. That's what I love the search feature for. Okay, so Ralph had stopped smiling and was pointing to the lagoon. Something creamy lay among the ferny weeds, a stone. No, a shell. Suddenly, Piggy was a bubble with decorous excitement. It's right. It's a shell. I've seen one like that before on someone's back wall. A conch, he called it. He used to blow it, and then his mum would come. It's ever so valuable. Near to Ralph's elbow, a palm sapling leaned out over the lagoon. Indeed, the weight was already pulling a lump from the poor soil, and soon it would fall. He tore out the stem and began to poke about in the water, while the brilliant fish flicked away on this side and that. Piggy leaned dangerously. Careful, you'll break it. Shut up. What are you noticing about their sense of respect for each other? Do they like each other? What's their relationship like, Piggy and Ralph, at this point in the book?
We're getting a lot of no's in the chat right now. Yeah, they don't like each other that.
Sorry, what'd you say? Anyone writing in the chat?
Yeah, lots of no's.
No's? No to what?
No to having respect for one another.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have respect for each other. In fact, you get the sense that Piggy's trying really hard to make Ralph like him, but Ralph, I think, thinks that he's kind of too cool for Piggy. And so he's being kind of rude to him, right? Telling him to shut up and that kind of thing. And at the beginning, Ralph does not like Piggy at all. He even makes fun of him. In fact, we had to skip over this part, but Piggy tells him that there was this really mean nickname the kids used to call him, Piggy. And then Ralph starts laughing and he's like, Piggy, Piggy, Piggy. And here you have, again, it almost seems like Piggy's going to get a fresh start on this island, right? He's going to get to start over, make new friends. And then suddenly He tells Ralph this word, and suddenly that's his name again. And later on, when they're with the other guys, Ralph shares this name Piggy to the rest of the group, and that just becomes his name. And so there's a sense almost of betrayal, right? Like Piggy tells Ralph this kind of mean, nasty name the kids used to call him, and Ralph thinks it's funny, and he just shares it with the other kids, right? And so Rosemary's right. Nobody knows Piggy's real name, and I think Golding did that on purpose, right? He wanted us to recognize that Piggy is a character who's misunderstood. He's overlooked. And the other kids, they don't appreciate what he knows, and they don't actually see his real value. And not even Ralph does. Towards the end, Ralph starts to feel really sorry for the way he's treated Piggy. And he starts to recognize the incredible value of Piggy as a person, okay? 12-year-olds, man. If you guys are 12, I hope that you're nicer than this. Okay, so there's so much description about this shell because it's what we call in literature a symbol, okay? So a symbol has to be a physical object in a story that has some higher meaning. It has an idea that's bigger that it's connected to, okay? So it needs to still be a functioning object in the story, but it also has to have these big ideas that are associated with it, okay? So in this story, the shell represents this kind of authority that Ralph has, right? The kind of civilization power that Ralph brings, the power to bring everybody together, okay? And so he's about to blow this conch. Okay. So he says, we can use this to call the others, have a meeting. They'll come when they hear us. Now down here, Ralph pursed his lips and squirted air into the shell, which emitted a low farting noise. This amused both boys so much that Ralph went on squirting for some minutes between bouts of laughter. He blew from down here, pointing to his stomach. Ralph grasped the idea and hit the shell with air from his diaphragm. Immediately, the thing sounded. A deep, harsh note boomed under the palms, spread through the intricacies of the forest, and echoed back from the pink granite of the mountain. Clouds of birds arose from the treetops, and something squealed and ran in the undergrowth. Ralph took the shell away from his lips. Gosh, his ordinary voice sounded like a whisper after the harsh note of the conch. He laid the conch against his lips, took a deep breath, and blew once more. The note boomed again, and then at his firmer pressure, the note, fluking up an octave, became a strident blare more penetrating than before. Piggy was shouting something, his face pleased, his glasses flashing. The birds cried, small animals scuttered. Ralph's breath failed. The note dropped the octave, became a low dubber, was a rush of air. The conch was silent, a gleaming tusk. Ralph's face was dark with breathlessness, and the air over the island was full of bird clamor and echoes ringing. I bet you can hear that for miles. Okay, so this is the power of the conch, and this is why Golding spent so much time describing it. It's somehow sacred, it's somehow magical, the way that it's being used and described. And immediately after, Piggy exclaimed, "There's one." A child had appeared among the palms about 100 yards along the beach. So from this point, all the boys start coming out of the forest together. And it's this really important and symbolic moment in the book about the forming of a civilization, people choosing to set aside their own values and come together to form a group and a community around some higher value, right? They decide after this point, we're going to find a plan to get home. They're going to light a signal fire to try to create smoke and attract a passing ship. They have all these plans of a civilization. They're going to build huts and structures. They're going to find food and water. And we feel pretty excited about this, but that only lasts so long. This other character, Jack, like we've mentioned, has a thirst for power. And so I'm just going to read you one last section from the end of chapter 1. Every chapter, by the way, begins on a high note and ends on a low note. Every single one. There's a sense of possibility and hope and optimism and inspiration at the start of every chapter. And by the end, there is a lot of worry and a lot of reality and a lot of fear. So even at the end of this same chapter, the counterpoint, once again, to the conch, the opposite kind of symbol that represents the power of violence is this knife that Jack has. So they go up on a trip up the mountain, and he's trying to catch a pig. So he sees this small pig and he thinks, I'm going to hunt and kill this pig, and then I'll bring the meat back, right? And we'll be able to eat. And watch the way that Golding describes this interaction with this other kind of symbol, not the symbol of authority, but the symbol of violence. Okay, so they were in the beginnings of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on a track when they heard the noises, squeakings, and the hard strike of hooves on a path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself at the elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle sharp, and insistent, right? This is a helpless baby pig trapped in the bushes. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause, a hiatus. The pig continued to scream, and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other and the place of terror. Jack's face was white under the freckles. He noticed that he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade in the sheath. Then they all three laughed ashamedly and began to climb back to the track. I was choosing a place, said Jack. I was just waiting for a moment to decide where to stab him. You should stick a pig, said Ralph fiercely. They always talk about sticking a pig. You cut a pig's throat to let the blood out, said Jack. Otherwise, you can't eat the meat. Why didn't you? They knew very well why he hadn't. Because of the enormity of the knife descending and cutting into living flesh, because of the unbearable blood. I was going to, said Jack. He was ahead of them and they could not see his face. I was choosing a place. Next time, he snatched the knife out of the sheath and slammed it into a tree trunk. Next time, there would be no mercy. He looked around fiercely, daring them to contradict. Then they broke out into the sunlight, and for a while they were busy finding and devouring food as they moved down the scar toward the platform and the meeting. So the reason I read this passage to you is it provides this counter example to that first scene of using the conch to call and bring people together. We start to see the first little flashes of violence in Jack here. And what's funny is he's only just gotten to the island and he hasn't become as destructive and violent as he will later. But this is foreshadowing of what's going to happen. And at first he wants to kill the pig, but he can't. He's held back by this good impulse in him and this feeling that violence would be so horrifying and so terrible, right? But slowly, the more time that he spends on the island, the easier and easier it gets for him to let down his guard and to become as savage and violent as he does become. So I wanted to read you these two parts from this first chapter because it does a great job of outlining the major ideas in this story, right? And the contrast between who Jack is and what he represents, who Ralph is and what he represents. So if you have not had a chance yet to read this story, I highly recommend it. You'll understand after my talk at least what some of the major ideas are to look for and the way that Golding continues to create these characters and make these really deep observations and messages about what it means to be human. And that's the end of my conversation with you guys today. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much for presenting for us. That was great. That was great.
Any last questions? I have to run in a second here, but I'm happy to answer a couple questions if you have them.
Yeah, so if anyone has any more questions about maybe parts about the book that we didn't get to discuss, I think now would be a great time to ask them before Mr. Acheson leaves. Rather silent right now.
Good. I would always be happy to come back sometime in the future, you guys, if you want me to create more conversation opportunities for you. This was fun for me, so thank you.
Yeah, it was fun for us, definitely too.
Good to hear.
Thank you so much.
Okay, everyone. Thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me. Happy reading and happy conversation, everybody. Take care.
Okay, thank you, Evan. Thank you for coming in.
You bet. Take care.
Yeah, keep in touch. We'll get you back later.
You bet.
All right.